I worked for a millionaire for 5 years, but never imagined what I saw in his daughter's drawing. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel to keep listening to real stories and secrets that few dare to tell. I still remember the first time I walked through the towering iron gates of the Carrington estate. It was late fall, the air thick with that cold bite that sneaks into your bones before winter settles in for good. The leaves crunched under my shoes as I made my way up the long, curved driveway. The mansion loomed ahead, all gray stone and sharp edges, like something pulled straight from a Gothic novel. There was no warmth in that place, not in the architecture, not in the air, and certainly not in the people I was about to meet. I had been contacted 2 weeks earlier by Sophia Carrington herself. Her voice over the phone had been soft, almost detached. She told me their daughter Emily was having some behavioral issues at school. There was no emotion in her tone, no urgency, just a bland delivery of facts. Emily was 8 years old, attending one of the most exclusive private schools in Manhattan, and apparently she'd started having sudden outbursts in class. Screaming, throwing things, hiding under desks. Nightmares too, according to Sophia, though that part she mentioned almost as an afterthought. I've worked with kids for most of my professional life. I specialize in trauma therapy. When a parent reaches out to someone like me, there's usually a crack in their voice, a tremor of worry, or even full-blown panic. But Sophia? Nothing. Just a schedule to coordinate and a reminder that her husband, Victor Carrington, was a very busy man and wouldn't be available for introductions. I pulled up in front of the house and a valet. Yes, they had a valet for guests, even on weekdays. Came to take my car. The front doors were enormous, dark wood with intricate carvings that felt more like a castle than a family home. As soon as I stepped inside, the smell of polished marble and cold air hit me. It wasn't just the absence of warmth in temperature, it was emotional. The house felt sterile. A woman in a tailored gray suit, who introduced herself as the house manager, led me through a series of echoing hallways until we reached the sitting room where I would conduct the session. It was one of those rooms that looked like it had never been touched by human hands. Everything was white or cream or glass. There were floor-to-ceiling windows that let in just enough light to make the room feel exposed, like being on display. Sophia sat on the edge of a long velvet couch, legs crossed, back ramrod straight, scrolling through her phone with one manicured finger. When she finally looked up at me, her expression was somewhere between annoyance and exhaustion. "Dr. Monroe, thank you for coming," she said without smiling. "Emily will be down shortly." I remember studying her for a moment, taking in the perfectly tailored dress, the flawless makeup that couldn't quite hide the dark circles under her eyes. There was something brittle about her, like she was holding herself together with invisible glue that might crack at any second. Before I could respond, a door opened down the hall, and a small figure emerged. Emily. She was tiny for her age, pale, with long dark hair that hung in loose, uneven strands around her face, like she'd cut it herself in places. She wore a simple gray dress and clutched a stuffed rabbit so tightly I could see the fabric tearing at the seams. Her eyes. God, I'll never forget her eyes. Wide and vacant, like she wasn't really there. Like whatever life had once been inside her had crawled into some hidden corner, too afraid to come out. "Emily, this is Dr. Monroe," Sophia said, glancing at her daughter without warmth. "She's going to talk with you today." Emily didn't respond, didn't blink, just stood there, staring at me like I was another piece of furniture in the room. Sophia gave a quick, rehearsed smile, mumbled something about errands, and left the room. And just like that, it was the two of us. I knelt down to Emily's level and spoke softly. "Hi, Emily. It's nice to meet you. I'm here just to hang out and talk if you want. Or we can draw. Or play. Whatever feels best for you." Still nothing. Not even a nod. I pulled out my therapy bag and set it on the floor. Crayons, paper, small sensory toys. I've learned over the years that children say more with their hands than with their words, especially when they're scared. I offered her a sheet of paper and laid out some crayons in front of her. For a few minutes, she didn't move, just sat on the floor, still clutching the rabbit. Then, without looking at me, she reached out with one trembling hand and picked up a black crayon. I watched in silence as she started to draw. Her lines were rough and fast, jagged. She pressed the crayon so hard against the paper that it snapped, but she kept going, using the broken tip. I leaned forward, careful not to startle her. The image took shape quickly. A house. Big, rectangular. The same shape kids often draw for their homes. But this one had no windows. Just doors. Lots of them. All shut. All with thick, exaggerated locks scribbled on each one. I felt a chill run down my spine. Most children Emily's age would draw stick figures playing outside, sun in the corner of the page, trees, maybe a dog. But this was a prison. I wanted to ask her about it, but I knew better. Pushing too soon could make her retreat even further. Instead, I stayed quiet, letting her finish. She drew something else next. A small figure, tiny compared to the house, placed outside the front door, alone. I swallowed hard. "Is that you?" I asked gently. For the first time, Emily's hand paused. She didn't look up, but she nodded. Just once. That tiny movement was the first real communication I got from her. I smiled softly, trying to mask the sinking feeling in my stomach. "Thank you for sharing that with me, Emily. You're really good at drawing." No response. I let her keep coloring while I jotted quick notes in my pad. The locks on the doors, the isolation, the darkness. Classic trauma indicators. The image of the small child outside, unable to get in, suggested feelings of abandonment or rejection, possibly fear. When our session ended, Sophia reappeared, all smiles for show, but with that same distant glaze in her eyes. She glanced at Emily's drawing but said nothing about it. As I packed my things, Victor Carrington himself finally made an appearance. Tall, broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, with silver cufflinks that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. He extended a hand, his grip too firm, like he was testing my reaction. "Doctor," he said with a cold smile that didn't touch his eyes. "I trust everything went well?" I nodded politely. It was a good start. Emily's very expressive with her art. His gaze flicked to his daughter, who was standing near the doorway, shoulders hunched, still clutching the rabbit. "I'm sure you'll do wonders," he said with the kind of finality that sounded less like encouragement and more like a warning. On my way out, I paused near the entryway. The air felt heavy, oppressive. I turned to glance back at Emily one last time. She was looking at me now, really looking. Her eyes weren't vacant anymore. There was something else there. A plea. Silent, but unmistakable. That first drawing stayed with me for days. Locked doors. A child alone outside. What was she trying to tell me? If you had asked me back then what I thought the life of a billionaire's family looked like, I probably would have painted a picture straight out of a luxury magazine. Lavish parties, glittering chandeliers, silk curtains swaying in the breeze from private terraces overlooking Central Park, smiles at charity galas, family vacations on private islands, posed photographs framed on mahogany walls. That's what the world saw when they looked at the Carringtons. And in some ways, all of that existed. But behind the gates of wealth, behind the polished photos, the designer clothes, and the headlines about Victor Carrington's latest Wall Street conquests, there was something rotten, something no amount of money could mask. I got used to driving up that long driveway, the iron gate swinging open automatically as if welcoming me to another carefully staged performance. Every time I entered that mansion, I felt like I was stepping onto a movie set where everyone knew their lines except me. Victor was always the director. Every room was curated like a showroom. Fresh flowers delivered daily. Silver trays with imported teas waiting in the sitting room. Even the air felt filtered, like they pumped it through some special system to keep out anything imperfect. Victor himself was rarely home during my early visits, but when he was, you could feel it. The energy in the house changed. The staff walked faster, spoke quieter. Emily would shrink into herself like a turtle pulling back into its shell. Sophia seemed to vanish in other ways. I tried to involve her more during our sessions at first. I suggested joint play therapy, offered to do parent-child interaction exercises. For the first few weeks, she sat in on the sessions, always poised, always distracted. Her phone never left her lap, and her eyes rarely left the screen. When I asked her to describe Emily's behavior at home, her answers were vague. "She's sensitive," Sophia would say with a shrug, flipping her phone around to check another text. "She gets that from my side of the family." Or, "She's just dramatic. You know how little girls are." I'd push gently, asking if there had been any recent changes at home, any tension Emily might be picking up on. Sophia's responses grew shorter each time. "She's fine. She's just acting out. I really don't have time for this kind of thing." After about a month, Sophia stopped showing up altogether. The house manager would bring Emily down for her sessions, leading her by the hand like a child delivering a package. I started keeping a journal. Not my professional notes. That stayed in Emily's file, carefully logged and worded with clinical neutrality. This was something else. A private record. A place where I could process the strange moments, the observations that didn't seem to fit the formal picture but haunted me anyway. I wrote about how the house felt colder every time I visited, how the security cameras seemed to multiply overnight, staring at me from new corners of the ceiling, how the cleaning staff never made eye contact, how Emily's drawings became darker, her lines more aggressive. And I wrote about Victor. When he did appear, he never stayed long. But those few minutes, they were enough. Enough to feel the control he exerted over everyone within those walls. His voice was low, deliberate, with the kind of tone that made you feel like every word was calculated for maximum impact. He never yelled. He didn't need to. Disapproval from Victor Carrington was a silent, heavy thing that filled a room without warning. One afternoon, I arrived early for a session and overheard a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. I had walked in through the back entrance, like always, and paused near the kitchen to organize my notes. From around the corner, I heard Victor's voice. "I don't want her discussing family matters," he said, low and sharp. "Her job is to fix the girl. That's it. If she steps out of line, let me know." There was a pause, and I heard Sophia's voice, quieter, more hesitant than I'd ever heard it. "She's just doing her job, Victor. She's overstepping." Their footsteps moved away before I could hear more. That session, Emily was unusually jittery. Her hands shook as she reached for the crayons. She kept glancing at the door like she expected someone to burst in at any second. She drew fast, almost frantically. At first, it looked like another house. Then I realized it wasn't a house this time. It was a hallway, long and narrow. The floorboards were drawn with harsh, parallel lines stretching from the bottom of the page to the top. On either side, there were doors, closed, just like in her previous drawings. But this time, there was something else. A figure, small, shadowy, standing near the center of the hallway. It had no face, no hands, just a silhouette. Black crayon pressed so hard against the paper it almost tore through. I swallowed hard. "Emily, who is this?" I asked carefully. She froze. Her tiny shoulders tensed, and her eyes darted toward the door. She shook her head, but her hand started trembling so violently that she dropped the crayon. I picked it up for her, placing it back on the table with a soft smile, pretending like nothing was wrong. But inside, my heart was racing. Was this a monster from her imagination? Or was she drawing someone real? After the session, I lingered in my car before driving away. I stared at my notebook, reading back my own words from previous weeks. The patterns were too obvious now. The isolation, the fear, the escalating behaviors at school. By then, Emily had been suspended twice for hitting classmates during recess. She'd been caught screaming in the girls' bathroom, slamming the stall doors, pulling out her own hair in clumps. The school counselor had emailed me privately, concerned that things were getting worse, not better. And still, no one from her family seemed alarmed. I started having nightmares myself. Dreams where I was back inside that mansion, wandering through endless hallways with locked doors, chasing after a child's voice I could hear but never find. One day, I opened my journal and wrote in big, underlined letters, "She's telling me something. I just don't know what." I couldn't shake the feeling that every time Emily picked up a crayon, she was handing me another piece of a puzzle that I didn't yet know how to solve. But I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was happening behind the gates of that house, it wasn't just about a little girl with behavior problems. And the shadow she had drawn in that hallway? I wasn't ready to admit it yet, but deep down, I feared the truth. That shadow had a name, and I already knew who it might belong to. It started gradually. At first, I almost didn't notice the shift in Emily's drawings. I told myself it was just her way of processing the things swirling inside her little mind, that the dark lines and strange figures were part of her working through whatever emotions she couldn't speak aloud. But with each passing week, the drawings got heavier, both in the way she pressed the crayon against the paper and in the content she chose to put on the page. I kept all of them, every single piece. I started a separate folder in my filing cabinet labeled simply Emily Artwork. I told myself it was for clinical documentation, but the truth was, part of me was afraid to throw any of them away. Like each one held some secret I hadn't figured out yet. A clue hidden between the crayon strokes and jagged lines. The closets appeared first. She would draw rooms, sometimes bedrooms, sometimes empty hallways, but there was always a closet, always with the door closed. Sometimes she'd sketch locks on them, thick chains wrapped around the handles, or strange shadowy lines leaking out from underneath as if something were trapped inside. I started incorporating gentle play narratives into our sessions. I'd bring out dollhouses, action figures, stuffed animals, anything to give her a safe way to project whatever she was feeling. I'd ask open-ended questions like, "What do you think is inside the closet in this drawing?" Or, "If you had a magic key, what would you do with it?" Every time Emily would clam up, her little hands would freeze mid-motion, and her eyes would glaze over like she had stepped out of the room in her mind. I tried art therapy prompts, things I'd used successfully with other children before. Draw a safe place. Draw something that makes you happy. Draw your family. But with Emily, the safe places still had locked doors. Her happy drawings were usually just blank pages with a single sun in the corner, as if she wasn't sure what happiness looked like anymore. And when I asked her to draw her family, well, that's when the faceless adults started appearing, figures towering over her, drawn in thick black lines with no eyes, no mouths. Sometimes they had their hands raised as if shouting or hitting. Other times they loomed silently in doorways like statues frozen mid-step. And Emily, always tiny in comparison, often curled up in a corner or sitting alone on the floor. One afternoon, she spent nearly the entire session coloring an entire sheet of paper in red crayon. Just red, layer upon layer, until the paper tore in the middle from the pressure. I remember sitting there, watching her with this slow, gnawing dread spreading through my chest. I didn't stop her. I couldn't. Not when this was clearly her only outlet. A few days later, during a routine school check-in, I got a call from her guidance counselor. Emily had been caught sitting in the corner of the playground, digging at the dirt with her fingernails until they bled. When a teacher tried to pull her away, she screamed so loudly the entire schoolyard froze. They said she kept shouting, "I didn't mean to! I didn't mean to!" over and over. That same week, I noticed the first set of bruises. It was a warm day, and Emily had worn a short-sleeved dress. When she lifted her arm to reach for a crayon, I saw the bluish marks along her upper arm, finger-shaped, unmistakable. I froze. "Emily, does your arm hurt?" I asked softly, keeping my voice as neutral as possible. She looked at me with wide, panicked eyes and immediately pulled her sleeve down to cover the marks. Then she shook her head so fast it made her hair fall over her face. I debated for hours that night whether to file a formal report, but Victor was clever. The next time I visited the house, he was already waiting for me near the entrance. For the first time since I'd started working with them, he acted almost cordial, offered me tea, asked about my workload. And just before I could bring up the bruises, he casually mentioned how Emily had taken a bad fall at recess the previous week. "You know how kids are," he said, flashing that polished smile. "Always roughhousing." I wanted to scream. Instead, I nodded politely and made a mental note to check Emily for new injuries during our next session. The sessions became more strained after that. Emily grew quieter, her eyes darting toward the door more frequently, like she expected someone to walk in at any moment. One day, I decided to try a storytelling exercise. I pulled out two dolls, a small one representing a little girl and a larger one for a grown-up. "Let's pretend this little girl lives in a house with this adult," I said gently. "What's their story?" Emily sat frozen for a long time. Then, without warning, she grabbed the adult doll and threw it across the room with such force it knocked over a lamp. I jumped, startled, but stayed calm on the outside. When I asked her why she did that, she just hugged her rabbit and whispered, "Because he's mean." My throat tightened. "Who's mean, Emily?" She clamped her mouth shut and shook her head violently. I didn't press her further. Not that day. A few weeks later, during another session, Emily spent almost the entire hour drawing another hallway. This one was longer than any before, with countless doors lining both sides. And right there, in the center of the page, another shadowy figure. Bigger this time, broader shoulders, positioned closer to one particular door that Emily had colored completely black. When I gently asked her about it, she dropped her crayon, grabbed her rabbit, and crawled under my office table, refusing to come out until the session ended. I noted everything, every drawing, every reaction, every regression. I knew something was happening inside that house, but without Emily saying it out loud. My hands were tied in so many legal ways. I felt like I was running through quicksand, reaching for a child I couldn't quite save. Then came the day she forgot her drawing. It was a Thursday afternoon. Emily had left in a rush, pulled away by the house manager faster than usual. When I went to clean up the session room, I found a piece of paper still sitting under the chair where she had been sitting. I picked it up and immediately felt my stomach flip. This one was different. It showed a small child, Emily without a doubt, curled up inside what was clearly a closet. Crayon lines boxed her in on all sides. Her little figure was surrounded by dark red smudges that spilled out across the floor of the drawing. The expression on her drawn face, it wasn't just sad, it was terrified. And next to the closet door, another shadow figure, this one larger than all the others she had drawn before. I sat there, staring at that drawing, my hands shaking. This wasn't symbolism anymore. I didn't know how, and I didn't know when, but I knew I had to find a way to reach her. Because whatever was happening behind those locked doors, Emily wasn't just drawing monsters. She was drawing the truth. The first sign that something had changed came from the smallest detail: Sophia's perfume. For months, every time I walked into the Carrington estate, there had been this faint trace of her, something floral and expensive, lingering in the hallways even after she'd left a room. It was subtle, but it was there. Then, one day, it wasn't. I noticed it the morning of Emily's session, about a week after I had found that forgotten drawing of the child trapped in the closet. The house smelled empty, like stale air and untouched furniture. I didn't think much of it at first. I assumed Sophia was away for the day, maybe on one of her charity board meetings or fashion events she was known for attending. But when I asked the house manager if Sophia would be joining us, her response was mechanical, rehearsed. "Mrs. Carrington is unavailable for the foreseeable future." That was all she said before walking away without waiting for follow-up questions. The next clue came from Victor himself. That afternoon, as I was gathering my things after Emily's session, Victor appeared in the doorway of the sitting room. His expression was colder than usual. His voice clipped. "I assume you've noticed Sophia's absence," he said without looking at me directly. "She's taken a personal retreat. Needed time to rebalance herself. Europe. No specific return date." There was something about the way he said it, like he was reading off a cue card. No emotion, no irritation, just a flat statement, as though informing me that the lawn service had been rescheduled. I nodded slowly, not trusting myself to say much in that moment. But Emily's condition spoke louder than any lie Victor could craft. The changes were immediate and severe. Over the next few sessions, her behavior spiraled in ways I hadn't seen before. Nightmares that left her shaking and drenched in sweat. She started wetting herself, both during sleep and, disturbingly, during our daytime sessions. The first time it happened, she burst into tears, covering her face with her hands and rocking back and forth on the floor, apologizing over and over in a frantic whisper. I reassured her gently. telling her it wasn't her fault, that it was okay. But inside, I felt like screaming. The drawings became almost violent. Thick, slashing lines of red and black filled her pages. Figures were no longer just faceless. They were monstrous, with jagged teeth and claw-like hands. The closets she drew now appeared open, with long, dark shapes pouring out from inside like shadows coming to life. One afternoon, as Emily sat at the low therapy table, she gripped the red crayon so tightly that it broke in half mid-stroke. She froze when it snapped, staring at the broken piece in her palm as if realizing something terrible. When I asked if she wanted a new crayon, she shook her head. Then, without saying a word, she picked up the black one and began drawing something I couldn't quite decipher at first. It wasn't until later that night, reviewing the image alone in my office, that I recognized what she had sketched: a staircase, leading down, into darkness. I knew the Carrington house had a basement, but I'd never been down there. The same week, her school called me. Again. Emily had been caught screaming in the middle of lunch, knocking over her tray and trying to crawl under the cafeteria tables. The teachers said she kept repeating the same sentence: "She's not coming back." I asked the guidance counselor if anyone had told Emily about Sophia's supposed trip. "No," the woman said. "As far as we know, the family hasn't mentioned anything. Emily just showed up like usual. But she looks different." That word stuck with me. Different. I decided to call Victor. I knew it was a risk. As her therapist, there were limits to how far I could push, but I couldn't sit by while Emily unraveled like this. I waited until late in the evening, hoping he'd be home and in a somewhat manageable mood. When he answered, his voice was as flat and cold as ever. "Dr. Monroe," he said with forced politeness. "To what do I owe this call?" I took a deep breath. "Victor, I'm concerned about Emily. There's been a sharp decline in her emotional state. Nightmares, regression, anxiety attacks. I need to ask, is there anything happening at home that she's reacting to? Anything that could explain this sudden change?" Silence. I waited, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. When he finally spoke, his tone dropped several degrees. "You are her therapist. That is your role, not to meddle in family affairs. If you continue to overstep, I'll be forced to find someone more suitable for our needs." I opened my mouth to respond, but he ended the call before I could say another word. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my desk, flipping through months of Emily's drawings, comparing dates, studying patterns. My journal entries from the first day I met her until now formed a timeline of silent screams. And then came the rain. It was a Thursday. The sky hung low and gray all morning, and by the time I arrived at the estate, heavy rain pounded against the mansion's massive windows. The air felt electric, like something was about to snap. Emily entered the session room with her head down, her rabbit clutched tighter than ever. Her hair was damp from the short walk between the house and the sitting room. I tried something different that day. Instead of my usual prompts, I just laid out blank sheets of paper and a full box of crayons. "I'm here if you want to draw," I said quietly. "Anything you want." For a while, she just sat there, staring at the floor. Then, without looking at me, she picked up 3 crayons, black, red, and brown, and started to draw. She worked faster than I'd ever seen her. The lines were deliberate, specific, not the chaotic scribbles of the last few weeks. At first glance, I thought she was drawing another hallway, like before. But as the picture came together, I realized this was something different. It was a room, small, cramped, with walls that seemed to close in toward the center of the page. In one corner, a child, drawn in her usual tiny scale, curled up on the floor, and across the room, a figure lying flat. I leaned in closer. Brown hair, a woman, motionless, and at the edge of the page, a set of stairs leading upward. My breath caught in my throat. I looked at Emily. Her hands had stopped moving. She was staring at the drawing now with an expression I hadn't seen on her before. Vacant, but not empty. Defeated. As I reached out to gently touch her hand, she pulled away, grabbed her rabbit, and curled up on the floor, her back to me. I sat there for several minutes, heart pounding in my chest, staring at the image on the page. I didn't know exactly what I was looking at, but I knew what it felt like a map, a location, a memory. The blood in my veins turned to ice, and for the first time in my entire career, I felt something I wasn't used to feeling as a therapist. Fear. Real, bone-deep fear. Not just for Emily, but for what might already be buried somewhere deep within the walls of that house. It was a Wednesday afternoon, colder than usual for that time of year. The kind of day where the air feels heavier, pressing down on your skin like some invisible warning you can't explain. The rain from the previous night had left the streets slick and gray, and by the time I pulled into the Carrington estate, my stomach was already in knots. I don't know why, but something inside me felt different that day, like I was walking into something I couldn't walk back out of. Emily was waiting in the usual room, sitting cross-legged on the floor with her back to the door. She didn't even glance up when I entered, which was odd in itself. Normally, she at least peeked over her shoulder when she heard the door click open. But that day, nothing. Her stuffed rabbit sat next to her, limp and forgotten. I approached slowly, crouching down a few feet away, careful not to startle her. "Hey, Emily," I said gently. "It's just me, Dr. Rachel." No response. Her hands were moving, though. Fast. Focused. She had already pulled out crayons from the bin I kept for her. Black, red, and brown. The same 3 she'd used for that haunting drawing of the basement weeks earlier. This time, though, there was something frantic in the way she moved. Her strokes were harsh and layered, her fingers gripping the crayons so tightly I worried she'd snap them. I sat in silence, giving her space, but watching closely. Every line she put on that paper felt like a scream without sound. Minutes passed. 10? Maybe 15? I don't know. I lost track. Then, without looking at me, she picked up the paper, stood slowly, and held it out with both hands. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. I took the drawing from her with trembling fingers, and then everything stopped. It wasn't like her previous drawings. This wasn't metaphorical. This wasn't a vague shadow figure or a faceless adult. It was Victor. There was no mistaking it. The outline of his sharp jaw, the way she captured the stiffness in his shoulders, even the small detail of his watch on his left wrist. The figure stood in the center of the page, looming over a lifeless woman with long brown hair sprawled across the floor. Red crayon, dark, layered, angry, bled out from under the woman's head, pooling across the lower half of the page, and in the corner, drawn in smaller, trembling lines, was Emily herself, curled up, inside what was unmistakably a closet, tears streaming down her tiny, scribbled face. I couldn't breathe. For a few seconds, I just sat there staring, the paper shaking in my hands. This wasn't symbolism. This wasn't imagination. This was a memory. I felt my throat tighten as tears filled my eyes, but I forced myself to hold it together. This wasn't about me. This was about her, about keeping her safe. I wiped my face quickly with the sleeve of my sweater and crouched back down to Emily's level. "Emily," I whispered, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Thank you for showing this to me." She didn't respond, just sat back down on the floor, curling her knees to her chest, rocking slightly. Her rabbit stayed abandoned on the far side of the room. I knew what I had to do. The rest of the session was a blur. I kept my tone light, kept my movements slow and non-threatening. I offered her a coloring book and turned on some soft music to help her settle while I gathered my things. But inside, my heart was pounding like a war drum. The second I left the mansion, I pulled my phone from my bag and made the call. Detective Laura Briggs. It had been almost 6 years since I last spoke to her in a professional setting. Back when she'd been my patient, she was a mess of anxiety and unresolved grief after losing a sibling to an unsolved crime. But now, Laura was one of the most respected investigators in the missing persons unit. I knew it was a risk contacting her, but I also knew she was the only person who wouldn't dismiss me. When she answered, I barely let her say hello before diving in. "I need your help," I said, my voice shaking. It's about one of my patients, a child. I think something terrible happened, and I think her father may have killed her mother." There was a pause on the other end. I heard Laura inhale sharply. Rachel, that's a serious accusation. I know, I said quickly. I wouldn't call you if I wasn't sure. I can't go into too many details over the phone, but I have something. A drawing. Something that, it's not just art therapy, it's a confession. From the child. Another pause. Then, where are you right now? I gave her the address of my office. Less than an hour later, she was standing in front of me, wearing jeans and a leather jacket, her hair pulled back in that no-nonsense ponytail she always wore on tough cases. I laid the drawing on my desk. Laura stared at it in silence for a long time. Finally, she let out a slow breath and looked up at me. "I'll open an informal inquiry," she said. Quietly. "No reports filed yet. Just background digging. If there's anything in Victor Carrington's past that looks off, I'll find it." I nodded, feeling the first tiny flicker of hope. "Thank you," I whispered. Over the next few days, Laura and I stayed in constant contact. I continued seeing Emily for sessions, pretending like nothing had changed, while Laura started pulling strings in the background. The more she dug, the worse it got. First, there were the property records. Victor had made several unregistered renovations to the Carrington estate over the past year. One of them a soundproof storage space installed in the basement. No official permits. No contractor names listed. Then came the financial records. Sophia's credit cards hadn't been used in over 3 months. Her social media accounts had gone dark even longer than that. Her cell phone had been disconnected. All signs pointed to someone who hadn't just left town, but someone who had vanished entirely. Laura pulled old missing persons reports too. 2 domestic staff members who had worked for the Carringtons had disappeared in the past 5 years. Both women. Both undocumented. Both cases quietly closed due to lack of evidence. With every new piece of information Laura sent my way, my stomach twisted tighter. And then, on the 4th day of her digging, Laura called me late at night. Her voice was low, urgent. "Rachel, I pulled some sealed court documents from out of state. You need to hear this." I sat on the edge of my bed, heart pounding. "Go on," I whispered. 10 years ago, in California, there was a restraining order filed against Victor Carrington by an ex-girlfriend. Claimed he'd physically assaulted her, threatened her life. Case was dismissed after she disappeared a month later. Never found. The room around me spun. My vision blurred. I gripped the edge of my nightstand to steady myself. "Jesus Christ," I breathed. Laura sighed. "This isn't just about Sophia anymore. This man, he has a history. And if Emily's drawings are what I think they are, we're looking at something much darker than just a missing person." I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake staring at my ceiling, going over every session, every word, every drawing, every cry for help Emily had made without using her voice. And with each passing hour, one truth became clearer. We weren't just racing to uncover the past. We were racing to save Emily, before she became the next person to vanish. The days leading up to the search were the longest of my life. Every hour felt like it stretched into days, and every night was worse than the last. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling of my apartment, replaying every conversation I'd had with Emily, every drawing, every small detail I might have missed. The guilt clung to me like smoke. For years, I had been in that house, sitting in that room, talking to that little girl, watching her scream for help in colors and shadows. And still, I hadn't seen the full picture until it was almost too late. Laura called me every evening with updates. Each one made the knot in my stomach tighten further. First, it was the phone records. Victor's statement to the police had been simple and specific. Sophia had booked a flight to Paris, left the house on a Friday afternoon, and called him from the airport before boarding her flight. He claimed she texted him from France a few days later, saying she needed space and didn't want to be contacted. But when Laura pulled Victor's phone logs, there was no outgoing call to Sophia's cell that day. No incoming calls from any international number in the weeks that followed. In fact, the last call from Sophia's phone had been placed to a local number 2 days before her alleged departure. After that, nothing. Then came the bank records. Sophia's personal bank account had been inactive since the week she left. No foreign transactions. No hotel bookings in Paris. No charges for plane tickets. Laura traced the supposed flight reservation and found that no such booking had ever existed in Sophia's name. Laura's team pulled security footage from the Carrington property as well. It took some legal maneuvering, but eventually the Carringtons' private security company coughed up copies from the week Sophia vanished. What the footage showed made Laura curse out loud over the phone. There were no recordings of Sophia leaving the house. Not by car, not on foot, nothing. The last time she appeared on camera was 2 days before her supposed flight, entering the house late in the evening. She never came out again. The pieces of Victor's carefully constructed story began crumbling, one lie at a time. Still, even with everything Laura had uncovered, it wasn't enough to get a search warrant on a man as rich and powerful as Victor Carrington. The DA's office wanted something more concrete, something that screamed probable cause loud enough to silence Victor's team of lawyers. That proof came in the form of a contractor, a man named Peter Delgado. He'd been hired for a single job at the Carrington estate about 3 months prior, an emergency flooring repair in the basement. Paid in cash, no questions asked. When Laura's team tracked him down, Delgado was visibly nervous during the interview. "I didn't ask what the smell was," he said, shifting uncomfortably in his seat at the precinct. "Wasn't my business. The guy said there was a leak, that the floor had to come up and go back down before his wife got home from her trip. That's all I know." Laura pushed harder. Eventually, Delgado admitted that when they tore up the concrete, there was already a large hole beneath it, freshly dug. He didn't see what went inside, but the implication was clear. That was the final nail. The search warrant was issued the next morning. I wasn't allowed near the property during the search, of course, but Laura kept me informed by the minute, her texts coming rapid fire as the police assembled their team and descended on the Carrington estate just after sunrise. I sat in my office, phone clutched in my hand, staring at the framed diplomas on my wall like they were anchors holding me in place. Emily's last drawing, the one that had changed everything, sat inside a folder on my desk, half buried under a stack of papers I couldn't bring myself to touch. I felt sick, terrified, helpless. I thought about Emily. I wondered where she was inside that house while the search unfolded. I wondered if she heard the footsteps above her head, if she knew what was happening. I prayed she was somewhere safe, far from the basement. Hours passed. Then Laura called. "They're digging now," she said, her voice tight and low. "In the corner of the basement, near the foundation wall, just like in the drawing." I couldn't speak. I just sat there, the breath caught in my throat, waiting. There was a long pause on the line. Then Laura said the words I'd feared but expected. "We found her." I closed my eyes as hot tears slid down my cheeks. Sophia's body had been wrapped in layers of plastic sheeting. The forensic team said the smell was overwhelming, even through their protective masks. The cause of death was obvious even before the medical examiner arrived. Blunt force trauma to the skull. The bloodstains on the concrete matched the placement Emily had drawn weeks earlier. Victor was arrested on the spot. Laura told me later that when the officers placed him in handcuffs, he didn't fight, didn't argue, just stood there, straightening his tie, keeping that same cold, measured expression he always wore like armor. But as they led him out of the house, he caught sight of me. I had driven to the street just beyond the property line, unable to stay away. I stood near the police barricade, heart racing, hands shaking, watching the whole thing unfold. And when Victor's eyes locked onto mine, he smiled. Not wide, not dramatic, just a small, knowing curve of his lips. Then, as he passed within earshot, he leaned toward me ever so slightly and whispered something that made the blood drain from my face. "She won't forget me," he said. Those 4 words. Soft, controlled, full of venom. I stood frozen in place as they pushed him into the back of the squad car. Even now, I hear those words when I lie awake at night. I knew then that for Emily, the nightmare wouldn't end just because the handcuffs clicked shut, and for me, neither would the fear. The days after Victor's arrest were a blur of flashing cameras, screaming headlines, and non-stop news coverage that turned the Carrington name into a national scandal overnight. Every time I turned on the television or opened my phone, his face was there, staring back at me from news tickers, breaking news alerts, and grainy courtroom sketches. Wall Street titan charged with murder. Empire built on blood? Victor Carrington? Father? Investor? Killer? It was surreal. This man who had once controlled boardrooms and intimidated Fortune 500 CEOs was now reduced to a mugshot on primetime television. The same cold eyes, the same tight jaw, but this time, stripped of his tailored suits and power ties, wearing an orange jumpsuit with the New York State Department of Corrections stamped across the back. I wish I could say there was a sense of triumph watching him fall, but there wasn't. Not really. The truth was heavier than that, more complicated, because with every headline, there was another reminder. Sophia was still gone, and Emily was still broken in ways that would take years, maybe a lifetime, to heal. The district attorney's office moved fast, pushing for no bail given the severity of the charges and Victor's clear capacity for manipulation and flight risk. His team of high-powered lawyers fought tooth and nail, but the evidence was overwhelming. Sophia's body, the timeline inconsistencies, the contractor testimony, and, though not presented as formal evidence, the haunting artwork that first pointed us in the right direction. The media dubbed it the closet confession. They didn't know the full truth behind Emily's drawings, of course. Confidentiality laws protected her identity, and I did everything in my power to shield her from the public circus. But inside the courtroom, behind closed doors, Emily was dragged into the legal process in ways no child should ever be. I sat beside her during pre-trial interviews, watching as she curled into herself, shrinking into that same protective posture I'd seen so many times in our sessions. The Child Advocacy Center provided a trauma specialist to walk her through the process. But even with their help, every question about that night chipped away at what little safety she had managed to rebuild. I remember one session vividly, sitting with Emily in the brightly lit interview room at the courthouse, her small fingers trembling as she traced the stitching on her stuffed rabbit's ear, refusing to look up at the detective asking her questions. "Emily, can you tell me who was there that night?" the detective asked gently. Her lower lip quivered, and for a long, agonizing minute, she said nothing. Then, so softly I almost missed it, she whispered one word, "Daddy." My heart broke all over again. The court allowed her testimony to be recorded in advance to spare her from appearing in front of Victor directly. But still, the emotional toll was unmistakable. Emily began having night terrors again, wetting the bed, refusing to eat. At one point, she even stopped speaking altogether for nearly 2 weeks. Her maternal aunt, Claire, flew in from Oregon as soon as the state granted temporary custody. Claire was everything Sophia had not been in those final years. Warm, attentive, visibly shaken, but determined to give Emily a new start. After the first meeting, Emily clung to her like a lifeline. I stayed involved as much as I could. I sat in the courtroom during the hearings, positioned in the back rows where Victor couldn't see me. Or at least, I hoped he couldn't. Still, every time his name was called, my stomach twisted into knots. Victor's defense tried every trick in the book, insinuating that Sophia had been mentally unstable, that her death had been an accident, that the evidence had been tampered with. They attacked the credibility of witnesses, even tried to discredit me, filing motions to have all therapy records excluded from discovery. Fortunately, Laura Briggs and the DA's office had built a case strong enough to withstand all of it. The day the guilty verdict was read, the courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the hallway outside, their cameras flashing like fireworks with every opening of the courtroom doors. Victor sat at the defendant's table, staring straight ahead as if none of it applied to him. When the foreperson stood and delivered the verdict, guilty on all counts of second-degree murder, unlawful disposal of a body, and child endangerment, Victor's face didn't flinch. Not even a blink. I watched from the back row as they placed the cuffs on him one final time. It wasn't until they led him past me that I saw the smallest crack in his facade. As he passed, he paused for just a fraction of a second and turned his head slightly toward the spectator benches. Our eyes met. His expression shifted into something unreadable, and then he was gone, just like that. After the trial, Emily and Claire left New York. The court arranged for their immediate relocation to Oregon for Emily's protection and emotional well-being. The goodbye was quiet. No big scene, no dramatic farewells, just a short, tearful hug outside my office as Claire loaded their suitcases into a rental car. Emily held my hand for a long moment before getting in. "I'll miss you," she whispered, her voice so soft it barely reached me. "I'll miss you too, sweetheart," I told her, holding back my own tears. "But you're going to be okay now. I promise." She nodded, hugging her rabbit tightly against her chest as they drove away. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into work, took on new cases, focused on other children, anything to keep my mind from spiraling into guilt and second-guessing. But late at night, when the world went quiet, the memories came flooding back. The drawings, the screams, the look in Emily's eyes that first day we met. I thought I was holding it together, until the letter arrived. It came in a plain white envelope, no return address, the handwriting shaky but unmistakable. I opened it with trembling hands, not knowing what to expect. Inside was a single piece of folded paper and a drawing. This time, it was different. The page was filled with color, bright yellows and soft blues. Emily had drawn a house, a small, cozy-looking one with flowers in front and big windows. There were no locks on the doors, no shadowy figures in the hallways, no closets. In the center of the drawing, she had sketched two people holding hands, a little girl with brown hair and a woman with curly hair, Claire, no doubt. And in the sky above them, Emily had drawn a sun with a smiling face. At the bottom, in careful, shaky letters, she had written, "Thank you for helping me get to the safe place." I sat at my desk, staring at the picture as the tears came, thick, hot, and unstoppable. I hadn't cried like that in years, not for any patient, not even for myself, but for Emily, for this tiny, brave survivor who had spoken her truth in the only way she knew how. I cried like I hadn't since I was a child, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something that had been missing for a long, long time: hope. Sometimes I sit in my office late at night, long after the last patient has left, with the lights dimmed low and the city humming outside my window. I sit there and I stare at that drawing, Emily's last drawing, the one she mailed to me from Oregon. It's framed now, centered on the wall right behind my desk, where I can see it every time I look up from my notes, every time I close my eyes to breathe between sessions. A house, flowers, sunshine, and two smiling figures holding hands. I've lost count of how many times I've stood in front of that frame, tracing the lines with my eyes, remembering what it took for her to draw that picture, what it cost her to get there, what it almost cost her to never get the chance. I think about the dozens, no, the hundreds of drawings that came before it, the locked doors, the dark hallways, the closets with shadows leaking out, the faceless adults towering over a little girl so small she almost disappeared on the page. I remember every line, every color choice, every tear-streaked session when she sat cross-legged on the floor, gripping that stuffed rabbit like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. And I think about how close, how terrifyingly close, she came to becoming just another name on a list, another silent victim buried beneath layers of fear and silence. That thought still keeps me up some nights. After the trial, after Victor's conviction, after Emily and her aunt settled into their new life on the other side of the country, I found myself questioning everything. I went over every decision I had made, every moment I hesitated, every time I convinced myself I had to wait for clearer signs. The training manuals, the ethics codes, the legal boundaries that had kept my hands tied for so long, they all felt like paper shields now, useless against the kind of darkness that had almost swallowed that little girl whole. For weeks, I carried that guilt like a second skin. I wondered how many other Emilys were out there, children sitting in therapy rooms across the city, across the country, drawing their pain because they couldn't speak it, hiding their trauma inside closets made of crayon and construction paper while the adults around them struggled to decode the message. That's when I made my decision. I filed the paperwork, met with lawyers, held meetings with community partners and trauma specialists, and within a few months, I launched something I should have started years earlier, a nonprofit, dedicated entirely to helping children process trauma through art. We called it the Safe Place Project. The mission was simple but urgent: provide free art therapy services to children facing abuse, neglect, or trauma, create partnerships with schools, shelters, hospitals, anywhere a child might be silently screaming for help but not yet able to say the words. I hired a small team: other therapists, art instructors, even a few volunteers from the local art college. We converted a small warehouse in Queens into our main space, painted the walls with bright colors, covered the floors with mats and cushions, brought in easels, paint sets, colored pencils, pastels, and shelves filled with every kind of paper imaginable. We made it a place where no door would ever be locked. Some days the kids come in and draw superheroes. Other days, monsters. Sometimes they just sit and scribble until their little hands cramp up. And slowly, over time, we help them find their voice again. I keep a separate file drawer now, not just for case notes, but for the drawings that make me pause, the ones that carry that silent weight, the ones that whisper things most adults don't want to hear. And every time I start to doubt myself, I open that drawer. I trace my fingers over the paper, and I remind myself why I do this, why I'll never ignore another drawing again. To this day, I still think about the moment Emily handed me that piece of paper, the one that broke everything wide open. I remember the feel of it in my hands, the way the air shifted in the room, the cold realization crawling up my spine. That single drawing saved a life, maybe more than one. There's something else I want to tell you. This hasn't been easy for me to share. Even now, sitting here telling you all this, I'm battling that familiar voice inside my head telling me I should have done more, done it sooner, been braver. But I also know this: silence protects abusers, and speaking the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it risks everything, is sometimes the only thing that saves a child. So now I want to ask you something. If you had been in my place, what would you have done? Would you have broken confidentiality sooner, risked your career, gone against powerful people with enough money and influence to crush you if they wanted? Or would you have waited, hoping for just a little more proof? Hoping the system would work the way it's supposed to? Tell me in the comments. Really, I want to know. What would you have done differently? And if you want to hear more real stories like this, stories that pull back the curtain on the things most people pretend not to see, then please make sure to subscribe. Because sometimes it's the stories we tell that keep someone else alive. If this story moved you, leave a comment and tell us which country you're watching from. We love hearing from you. Leave a like and subscribe to keep listening to real stories and secrets from the elite. Click on the story on your screen. It may reveal more than you imagine.